Paul here. My name's Paul Walton. I'm the Head of Environment and Rural Economy for the New Forest National Park Authority. We've got a very busy schedule this morning. We're delighted to have some external speakers with us. In a moment, I'm just going to hand over to Alison Barnes, who is the convener of the Green Halo Partnership. I would just like to remind everybody that if you have comments or questions, please put them in the chat. The meeting is being recorded, so hopefully everybody is happy with that, and we will be putting the recording of the meeting on the Green Halo Partnership website in due course. Please check the Padlet function that we have. You can find that at the top of the chat, and please put any thoughts that you have in there as we go through the morning, and do please keep your questions coming as you respond to the speakers in the chat, and we will have a couple of question and answer sessions throughout the morning. So I'm going to hand over now to Alison Barnes, who will start us off. Alison.
So, good morning, everybody. A very warm welcome to the Green Halo Conference. Slightly different circumstances than our previous conversations, but it's wonderful to have around 200 of you with us today. And of course, the wonders of technology mean that we can actually share this much more widely than we usually do. So that's great news. We're marking today the 5th anniversary of the Green Halo Partnership. Seems almost unbelievable that 5 years ago now, we gathered with the help of Business South at Ordnance Survey with some key public, private, third sector partners to talk about the idea of natural capital and whether we had any kind of vision for that in our area. Back then, the concept of natural capital, the notion that nature provides us with goods and services for free, if you like, was confined to a relatively small number of specialists, economists, ecologists who understand how those systems work, if you like. But we knew even then, obviously, that plenty of people cared about the environment and they wanted to protect the natural spaces and species of our area. But generally, there was seen to be a choice. Either you could protect nature or you could go forward with economic progress. And I think keeping our thinking towards natural capital has helped us acknowledge that nature provides us something within those value systems. It leads to a different and more constructive way of thinking. So natural capital, seeing nature as a benefit and an opportunity, has very much put this partnership sort of firmly in its place. And this was a concept, of course, that we moulded into our vision back then in 2016 to be an exemplar of precious landscapes working in harmony with a thriving economy and community. Today on the Padlet, we've got the chance to say whether we think that's still the right vision. But all I can say is that that has been kept alive over the last 5 years through our discourse and relationships and projects and actions. And I'm very, very grateful for all of you for staying involved in that conversation. Of course, our part of the world has a very diverse and important natural heritage, whether it be the renowned sites along the Solent for birds or spaces at the hearts of our towns and cities. And of course, we are blessed with a fantastic national park shaped by the practices of commoning and the work of the communities over many hundreds of years. We also have a diverse and strong economy. And okay, we've been hit, all of us, by a very tumultuous year with COVID. But I still think we can say, and it's something that I say a lot, that we have a world-class environment and a world-class economy and a world-class set of people working towards those thriving. So we have a unique set of opportunities in our area to tackle the issues of today, whether it be building economy back from COVID, tackling health inequalities, or of course the climate and nature emergencies. Since our partnership began, all of these have skyrocketed through the political agenda. Obviously, we've seen in the last year so many people really needing nature and what it offers for their physical and mental health and well-being. And I think you could say that our vision is of its time. So maybe we were 5 years ahead, I don't know. And of course, that famous Victor Hugo quote, "There's nothing more powerful than an idea whose time has come." So today we ask, how are we going to use that power of the idea whose time has come? A huge amount of credit obviously goes around the natural capital conversation to our keynote speaker. And we're delighted that Professor Sir Dieter Helm will be joining us at 10 o'clock to share his reflection and some challenges for us for the future. He and his committee worked tirelessly, reporting, advocating over 10 years as to why natural capital has become central to our environmental debate and should do in the future. And that's reflected in government's 25-year environment plan, as well as the recent Agricultural Act and the forthcoming Environment Bill. But I think at a local level, you, the Green Halo Partnership, can take much credit for the fact that natural capital is very much part of our conversation in this area. And of course, there are many inspirational ways that that has also been taken forward, particularly through things like the Wild 2030 plan led by the Wildlife Trust and many, many local projects that are happening around our area. Today, you will hear from some great speakers around a few examples of where natural capital is being picked up and used to shape initiatives across our region. They've all come together because people have just stopped in their tracks and asked, what if I did this, and why not do something around natural capital in the way that I work? And a huge thanks goes to all those people for taking that leap of faith, if you like, and particularly to the steering group, who I'll name check later, for all their energy and support in getting us where we are today, helping us all to hold a space which is safe and open to inspire each other and to be better than the sum of our parts. And I think that our area deserves absolutely nothing less, but I think you all know how strongly I feel about that. Okay, we've never been a partnership that has been blessed with huge budgets or major projects, but our role has been different from the start, to begin these conversations, to raise awareness and to bring people together to generate ideas. Coming together as equals is important, with both challenge and support. And from my perspective, it's been an absolute privilege to convene conversations over those 5 years and to hear the ideas and the inspirational thoughts that you have all had. But today is not about looking back, really. It's about looking forward, and we must do that. This is ever more important. We need action to reduce carbon dioxide emissions. We need to reverse the decline of biodiversity, recover our health, tackle air pollution, and recover from COVID. And the opportunities that a natural capital perspective offers, alongside our renewed connection with nature, make genuine opportunities available to us to make improvements to our place. I'm convinced that the real change really must take place at our local level. It requires us, our communities and individuals, to change, to influence each other's decisions, and to guide where we invest on our economic capital. And that's what I believe the Green Halo Partnership should be focusing on as we look forward to 2030 and beyond. But of course, you all have your own ideas to share today. We need to be exploring practical actions that build and strengthen the stock of our natural capital to ensure that we use this capital to support our communities, to reach net zero, to close health gaps, and also to cut air pollution. Being an exemplar, I think, of working with and through nature will really bring our region, our area to the fore. And we should be a place where young people can see the revolution for green skills and jobs in front of them. So I'm going to be very much looking forward mainly to hearing what you have to say today, and of course the thoughts of our great speakers. This morning is about where we go next together. It's always been that way with the Green Halo partnership, and we're only as good as what we all do and contribute. So I'm sure today that our conversation will be an inspiring one, as it always is, and I'm looking forward to spending the next 2 hours with you. So that's all from me, just as way as introduction. We've got Dieter Helm joining us around about 10 o'clock, but we're very delighted to be able to bring forward our first speaker, and that is Aldred Drummond. So I think Aldred is certainly here. I'm sure that many of you will know Aldred. Obviously, he is leading the development at Forley Waterside, and in 2015, as you know, that company purchased the power station site on the waterside next to the New Forest, and it very much has an ambition to create something transformational for our place. So we're absolutely delighted you're here, Aldred, and of course many of us in the New Forest will know you and your family as the custodians of the Cadland estate. And we're so fortunate to have you in our patch because we know how passionate you are about the long-term prosperity and the heritage of our area. So without further ado, I'm going to pass to Aldred. We will then hear from Professor Sir Dieter Helm and then stop for a few questions and answers. So back to Paul to make all that happen. Thank you.
You're on mute, Paul.
Rookie error, thank you. So Aldred, I'm going to hand over to you, and you have your presentation. I have a backup if needed. So let's hope the technology holds up. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Alison, very much for the introduction. I'm just going to share the presentation now. I hope it works. Is that up, guys? I can't see. Hello?
Not yet, I'm afraid, Aldred.
Okay. Stop.
Thanks everybody for their patience on this. I'm sure we're all familiar with the intricacies of Teams and Zoom meetings, so appreciate you holding fire.
Paul, are you able to bring up the presentation on Aldred's behalf?
Yes, I'll see if I can do that. So Aldred, the presentation is loading on my screen, but quite slowly.
Which is, I could start talking if that's all right. Yes, well, Alison, thank you very much for the introduction. I remember some time ago Oliver Crosswaite-Ayres saying one of the most important things one must consider living in the New Forest is always to put the New Forest first. And that has been quite a challenge with a project like Forley, but I hope that the work that we've done very much hand in glove with the National Park has shown that that ethos is very much carried through with this project. What we have to remember that the New Forest has lived side by side with the largest petrochemical works in Europe. one of the largest petrochemical works in Europe. And I think this zeitgeist, this change is phenomenal. You know, we are seeing now the transformation of the Fawley Power Station, which was the largest oil-fired power station in Europe, into something completely different as we transition from a carbon-dominated economy of the last 100 years, remembering that Fawley Refinery was first built in 1920, and now we're in 2021. And what we need to look for is the next 100 years and make sure that we are still here in the next 100 years and that sea level rise hasn't covered most of or large parts of the New Forest. But we also have to keep our economy going, as Alison says. So this is really a tremendous opportunity to enable both economic growth and the prosperity of our communities, but do it in a way that is sustainable and beneficial to the environment. I don't know whether you've got the presentation now, Paul.
I think there's about 30% left to go, Aldred.
Okay. The Fawley project is, as I said, the transformation of the oil-fired power station. We are about a year away from completing the demolition. It's taken us nearly 6 years to accomplish that. It took 10 years to build and 6 years to knock down. And it will take probably 25 years to build out the project, which will end up being about 2 million square feet, sort of 1,500 homes, and 2 million square feet of commercial space. So it really will be a very large employment centre along the waterside and enable that transition into a new future with a different type of employment. The master plan is very extensive, and what I wanted to particularly focus on today was the interrelationship both with the wider estate and then come on to where I think the Freeport can take us, and looking at a much wider landscape plan that would encompass both the land as well as the sea. We have to remember that we've got the great port of Southampton and various development projects along the waterside that are likely to come forward over the next 10 years. If you flick on one, please, Paul. So this is the a bird's eye view of what the town, the planning consent could enable. And you can see that we're trying to very much fit the town onto the area of the power station, but also make it very much fit into the landscape. If I go on to the next slide, one of the challenges and opportunities, and something I know is very dear to Alison's heart, was to connect the forest back to the sea. And this does include a very large landscape plan, which I hope will be a blueprint for other developments along the waterside. And so we have a 650-acre landscape plan that folds into a 3,000-acre estate plan, so that we can see that both the town and the estate can work symbiotically. And that brings forward many opportunities, which I think will extend into the wider forest, particularly food production for communities and health and well-being. So this is I like to say, the largest extension of the New Forest since the Normans, because we are coming back through what was formerly farmland, then gravel pit land, and creating a new forest landscape. And I believe Kim Wilkie is on the conference and has been instrumental and very much part of this project. So we see the connection of the forest back to the sea. We see a 36% increase in biodiversity. Move to the next slide, please, Paul. And this is captured, this is only part of the master plan, but you can see very much, again, trying to thread the town back into the forest and to get the grazing animals from the northern part of the estate, which is very much of the New Forest landscape, back to the sea, to take the coastline almost back to where it was on Tom Tiddler's land before the power station was built, and also then enable livestock to graze within the town itself, and well, in the southern reaches of the town. Next slide, please. This is the site as it is, and as you can see, the demolition is well underway. The chimney is due to come down in September, probably likely late September, October. And that already, with that remaining of the boiler house building, is already seeing a major landscape transformation from what was the largest building in Britain to something of very, very much more domestic scale. Next slide, please. The next slide, please. We'll click on past this. So sustainability vision and framework, which is very much part of this project. And it is ambition at this stage. You know, we are all learning how we will get there. Gary Wilburn, I know, is another fellow traveller in this field, and we've been looking very much at building materials and sustainability in individual buildings. But this is also, as Alison said, part of the zeitgeist. The market is going to demand that we get here. We have to differentiate. We cannot carry on building in the way that we have. And with something like Fawley at this scale, we have an extraordinary opportunity to do it very differently. And we're taking a very long-term view. You know, we've as a family, we owned this site 60 years ago. We've been here 250 years, and we want to continue to be very much part of the New Forest for the next 250 years. So this is a very long-term vision that we're taking on here. Next slide, please. So these are some of the key points that I wanted to draw out. Local and sustainable food. There's a huge opportunity to transform the economy of the farming business on the estate from farm to fork, and to take a much more regenerative attitude to the farming. At the moment, we're very much a global commodity supplier, and we will transition to an organic farm because we can then afford to, by being able to take more out of the market. At the moment, it's very difficult to become an organic farmer at scale, and with the town and the integration of the markets within the town of restaurants and hotels, etc. This will give the estate a great opportunity, but I also see it as a great opportunity for the wider New Forest and the food production systems therein. Next slide, please. These are all of, we've taken One Planet Living as an exemplar, and we look at zero carbon energy, and that I focus on that one. We've got very short of time, so I'm not going to go through all these. That's probably the most challenging one here. Land and nature we can do very well. Zero waste we can plan. Travel and transport, by building a sustainable community, you can really plan that out. Zero carbon energy is difficult. You can reduce energy, and that's probably the easiest thing we can do by creating a sustainable community, a walkable community. But on-site generation, I believe, will come through things like tidal energy, but is not there. That is a journey that we're still working through. Next slide, please. Local sustainable food, as I touched on before, and all of this is wrapped up in health and happiness and equity and local economy. These projects must put back in. Too long, the projects of big housing projects have been done by large national house builders that really have, you know, one eye on the profit line and very few eyes on anything else. And this is very much not the project that we envisage for Fawley. Next slide, please. So going back to the wider estate, that is the landscape plan of the nature park, which is about 650 acres around the power station redevelopment. And those sort of light yellow areas are cover crop fields, which could be brought in to reduce nitrate runoff into the Solent and Southampton water. So this has been very much looked at a landscape scale. So regenerating the gravel pit workings, transforming the 650 acres back into you know, a more sustainable, a more biodiverse landscape has very much been the ethos here. And being able to do something for nitrate neutrality has been a fascinating journey. And I just hadn't realised how much nitrate was actually flowing into the Southampton and Solent until we started. So we've learned an enormous amount about our local area through this project. Next slide, please. This was something Jonathan Cox, our eminent ecologist, put together, showing all of the different landscape types. And we've now overlaid that with a great report produced by a company that Sir Dieter is involved with, called called natural capital research, which we've done with the LEP and with some of the other large landowners. And this is really going to be a great baseline for what I'm going to come on to talk about next. So next slide, please. This was produced by the National Park and the District Council, which was an environmental infrastructure vision. That was the sort of start of thinking about, you can see the lines connecting the New Forest back to the sea. And I think with the Freeport, this and the ambition of the Freeport to be a green Freeport, this is really what we need to build on now. There is going to be quite a considerable amount of public money, government money, to be invested in the Freeport. And we must channel some of this into creating landscape scale solutions that enable the development of economic prosperity along the waterside, which our communities need. But this must be in partnership with a much greater biodiverse and carbon sequestration plan, which I'm sure Dieter will talk about at a very high and important level. I was struck some years ago by going with Alistair Welsh from ABP, who's the port director, to the port of Rotterdam, where they've just expanded the port of Rotterdam by 5,000 acres. And they don't talk about mitigation, they talk about environmental gain. And the environmental gain projects that the port of Rotterdam had instituted were so enormous that they had completely outstripped any sort of opposition, because it was so demonstrable that the biodiversity gain from this project was going to outweigh the harm of creating some additional land for the port. And this is the lens through which we must look. And I think natural capital gives us that value. It values the natural capital, which we must value, and gives us the basis to say, well, if we need to do this, we must do something on a much greater scale to replace and enhance and encourage, you know, all of the good things that Alison talked about, and increasing the well-being and prosperity of our local community. And I think this is the way that we will get buy-in. This will how the communities will see that they are the recipient of this economic prosperity, but also the environment is the recipient of this economic prosperity. And that the two things must go absolutely hand in glove. As said, we have an extremely precious landscape, and one which is very fragile. And we must do all that we can whilst maintaining ourselves, and our, you know, we're not going to go back to the Stone Age of reducing populations back to sort of pre-farming levels. But we must encourage ourselves to look very, you know, very widely and very ambitiously. So next slide, please. I asked Jonathan Cox to start bringing together a New Forest coast nature recovery strategy to look at the coastline, particularly along the waterside, really running from Rumsey down to Lymington. And I think to build on what the previous slide, and if you think about the waterside, there are actually only 5 landowners along the waterside, really. And between those 5 landowners, we own circa 10,000 acres. So there is, you know, a huge opportunity in collaboration with those landowners to do something of great scale, something that could be nationally important for Britain and critical to the survival of the New Forest. This strategy is embryonic, but is something that Alison and I have talked about often, and something that I think we really need to put great energy into through Green Halo. And a lot of this has been inspired by your next speaker, who I've had many happy hours talking to about the principles of natural capital and natural capital enhancement. So with that, I leave you and look forward to the next speaker. Thank you.
Huge thanks, Aldred. Really wonderful to see your inspiring ideas of how we go forward from here, and thank you for everything you've been doing over the last 5 years and more to bring us to this place. I feel like you've probably introduced our next speaker probably even better than I will, but I will make another go at it, because I'm sure Professor Sir Dieter Helm needs no introduction to us as a partnership because he's very much been the inspiration for all we've been doing really as a partnership over the last 5 years. He is obviously a very esteemed academic at the University of Oxford. Was the independent chair for the Natural Capital Committee, which ran for 10 years, providing the advice to government on natural capital until the term of that committee ended in November last year. And of course, I'm sure he will speak about it, but the legacy of a number of policies and statutes very much speak for themselves on that. And very big congratulations, Dieter, for your award of a knighthood at the end of the year last year, richly deserved. Also, he served on a number of other committees nationally and internationally. And also, we're delighted that he is the chairman of Natural Capital Research, because we've been able to work with that organisation to bring forward a baseline for natural capital in and around the waterside with Aldred and the Lep. And obviously, because of the catchments, that covers the whole of the New Forest. So that gives us a great springboard to move forward. And so we're grateful for your support today and for your interest of the Green Halo Partnership, Dieter. And thank you for coming to give us a challenge for our future today. Over to you.
Well, thanks very much, Alison, for inviting me along. I have to tell you that in this great modern age of infrastructure, the university network has suddenly decided to do funny things. So if I sound less than clear, it is due to the wonders of the infrastructure. And this just suddenly happened. So I hope this is going to be okay going forward. Please let me know if it's not clear. So I assume you can hear me clearly. Yeah.
Yeah, we can indeed. Thank you, Dieter.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation, and great to follow Alison and Aldred. What I'd like to do is to just do a stand back to start with on where the whole natural capital and broader policy frame has got to. Then I'd like to say a bit about what's actually the natural capital of the area, so the baseline that's been constructed. And then I want to focus on what could be done, picking out some of the themes that Aldred raised, but raising the ambition and thinking quite hard about how to work out what the opportunities are and how they're going to get paid for, which is an important part of any such calculation. So, I mean, if we start at the highest level, if you look at the area covered by Aldred's maps and the areas that you're all very familiar with, it's pretty clear that two things are stand out. The first is this is an amazing economic zone. This is high tech, high skills. This is a future growth pole for the economy as a whole. We hear an enormous amount about the northern powerhouses and all those kinds of things. But actually, if you look at the area around Southampton, along the Solent through to the parks, this is the potential to be 21st century rather than 19th or 20th century, which is some of the legacy that unfortunately some of the northern cities and ports have with them. So I don't think there's any question about the economic prosperity of this area. I think it's also the case that we've moved on to a world in which the economy was thought to be the most important thing, and it didn't matter too much how much environmental damage you did, as long as it was jobs, 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 and trade, trade, trade. And I think that one of the great successes of the last 10, 15, 20 years has been to realise that that old model of economy versus the environment is basically completely redundant. It's nonsense. And you can see it most clearly in your area. You know, you cannot simply trash the environment and expect high quality, high paid industries, businesses, technologies to bring people to the area and those people to live healthy and fulfilling lives. That's just impossible. And if anyone wants to think about it on a very macro level, you know, what we've done in the 20th century is enormous economic progress, but at the expense of trashing the climate and trashing the biodiversity. And that's all over. Everybody now recognises that climate change is incredibly important, and everyone realises, I hope, that the destruction of biodiversity cannot go on. And I think it's very important to be clear about this. You know, this is unsustainable, what's been happening, and therefore it will not be sustained. It's just a question of how it's not sustained if we don't do things ex ante to put a lot of this on a much better platform. So let's forget about jobs versus the environment, about
Dieter, I'm afraid we're losing your audio connection. Well, we appear to have lost Dieter temporarily, which is rather unfortunate, particularly as he's probably in an area where one would anticipate that the connections would be better than perhaps in this local area. But Alison, I was just wondering whether we can come back to you.
I just thought I would just talk about what we're going to hear later on, and if you could try and get hold of Dieter and see if you can get him back, that would be great.
Will do.
So so just to introduce and save time perhaps for later on, once we've heard from Dieter, hopefully all fingers and toes crossed, we're going to have some Q&A with Dieter. He's got to leave us at 11:15, so obviously it's important that we get your questions to him. But we're also going to hear some short presentations from the Chief Executive of the Sonat Anne-Marie Mountefield, who's going to respond to what Dieter hopefully says in a moment. He's back.
I'm sorry, we have this terrible problem in the universities at the moment, the whole network. I think it came down yesterday with the cloud problems, but it was all right first thing, and it's now keeps flicking. But shall I resume and try and carry?
Yeah, so we lost you around about the time where you were telling us we can't, you know, survive with a dichotomy between the two. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm very sorry about this. I thought coming to my university office was the most reliable possible way of doing these things, but these things conspire against. So the point I'm making is we can't go on like this, and I think that's recognised. Now, the good news in the UK is that a huge number of steps have now already been put in place. So it's not a question of having a generalised argument. This is about delivery. So we have an Agriculture Act, which changes the whole basis of agricultural support, and that's 70% plus of our land. So that's one big bit, public money for public goods, which makes the incentives of landowners quite different. We've got the Environment Bill going through Parliament, which has statutory targets for air quality, water quality, carbon, of course, waste and biodiversity. These are statutory requirements, and they will have to be met by any development, by any regional plan, any thinking ahead of the environment. All good news, with a statutory authority to oversee the delivery. We've got the amendment to the Climate Change Bill, which means that we have to do net zero by 2050 and 78% in 14 years. So this is really urgent. There is no time to hang around about this, and the parks and the areas are absolutely critical to the carbon equation for this area. It's not just particular projects that have to be net zero. This area has to be net zero in totality. And that's why the bigger plan, the bigger picture that Aldred put up, you have to think about net zero for all of that lot and more, because there are going to be emissions that continue, and therefore we have to have carbon offsetting. So we have to do more than simply try and reduce emissions. We have to do the other half of climate change, which is to get on with using the natural environment to soak up carbon. It's done it for thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of years. It's soaked up carbon from the atmosphere to give us the climate we've got at the moment. And sequestration is every bit as important as emission reduction. We need both. So that's the frame. So if you now look at the area and you think about it in totality, the wider picture, then the first thing to say is one needs to be absolutely clear what one's got. You can't value what you're going to do until you know the baseline and the ability to know scientifically whether you are getting better or getting worse. And that's critical. It's not just the creation of the natural capital baseline, the taking into account all the assets in the area. On top of that, it's the ability to show over time, repeating and repeating and repeating, whether or not progress has been made. Too often in the past, people have committed to, do environmental regeneration, to offset damage done, to do good environmental things. And the result has been, yeah, we've done very well. I know some things have gone down, but some things have gone up. None of them are measured. So we can all have a qualitative argument about whether or not things have been achieved. What a baseline enables to happen is that you can see whether in fact things have improved and by how much. That's critical. So you're well on the way in this process, because there is now a baseline, which my colleagues in natural capital research have done, and that can be just rerun whenever and however often is required. That's the start. And just looking at that baseline, you realize quite quickly how many really important natural capital assets there are, of course, particularly in the park, thinking about the carbon, the trees, the potential peat, but also in the wider area. The marine area, which the foreshore, which refers to, absolutely critical in that. So that's a big plus. But now you have the facility to work out which enhancements to make, which will deliver the greatest systems natural capital bucks for the money. Because we can all have idealistic pictures of what we'd like to happen. The critical thing is to make sure that we use the scarce resources available to the best possible purposes for the natural capital systems as a whole for the region. Okay? So the way this works is you take your baseline and you come up with the projects which you might like to pursue. You can think about them on a grand scale, which is effectively what Aldred and his colleagues have been thinking about, Kim Wilkie and others. And you can then say, what would the this break into the national change baseline would have happened if it certain enabled you to what is to achieve, and crucially whether you would. So this is taking the approach to the environment and vital capital from what I regard largely primitive framework general discussion, although lots have been achieved, to a much more scientific base. Let's work out for the resources available where the best benefits are. And those benefits are not simply, though they're very importantly, things like biodiversity. All these people who are going to live in this area, already live in this area need access to nature. That's what, if anyone doubted it, we've learned through this pandemic. The recreational resources, the mental, physical health, etc., all of these are critically important. And that's where the whole thing has to link up. It's no good having natural capital there for potential benefits to people. They actually have to get there, and not necessarily in hordes of cars which produce massive traffic jams. You need public transport and other systems to work with that. So it has to be integrated. But the critical thing is to take that baseline, work out what the enhancements are, and lots of people have different ideas about what should be done where and in what form. And of course, remember that it's always constrained. Because you have such a thriving area and such a important and large population, the pressures on the park in particular, but the pressures on the water supplies, whole issue about desalination, etc., the pressures to provide the infrastructure for the ports, etc., all of this has to be taken into the frame. And so it's not simply a question of, we'd like to do certain things. It's not even a question of ambition. It's pretty obvious that you have the ambition, but the ambition is worthless, if I dare say it, unless you have practical plans of how to deliver this and take it forward into an even better outcome going forward. And that links to the accounts for all of this. It's not just that one wants to think about the enhancements of what goes forward. One also wants to think that you need to protect any of the existing natural capitals that are renewable, that nature keeps giving us for free and keeps on giving us for free in perpetuity. It is our task to leave the next generation with a set of natural capital assets at least as good as we inherited. That's official policy, was policy of the last government, and is at the heart of the Environment Bill. Okay? Well, what does that mean? Well, let me a little detailed in this. It means that there can be no depreciation of the natural capital assets. It means that capital maintenance has to make sure that there's no deterioration. We're all familiar. I don't know what it's like in your area, but I'm certainly familiar around Oxford, that at the moment you wouldn't want to go cycling anyway because you'd probably kill yourself in a pothole. Nobody's repairing the roads. Okay, so this is a classic example. We pretend that we're better off as our local authorities, etc., around our area because we're not spending money on the roads. We're not better off. The roads are deteriorating. The capital stock, the physical capital stock we're passing on is getting worse. So someone will have to pay for it. You can think of climate change as a massive failure in capital maintenance of our climate. And if you look at the areas involved and look at the pressures, particularly in the national park, there is a real danger that things could go backwards, that capital maintenance isn't being properly provided for, isn't being properly funded, and therefore, as a result, we're not fulfilling even that minimal condition of not letting things go backwards. So when I talk about a baseline against which we work out what enhancements there are, how we can make things better, we of course always have to have the check at the back of our mind, don't let things get worse. Now, of course, there will be some environmental damage from the economic activities that people are proposing in the area. It's impossible to leave the environment in aspic. We never have since humans came on the planet. And the question is, if there is damage, first of all, have you been through the process of trying to avoid any possible damage? But then, if it really is the case that some damage is done, and we have this with house building on a massive scale at the moment, then the principle of net gain is crucial. So we can leave the environment in aggregate better off than we've inherited it, and we can have some damage, provided that we more than compensate for the damage that might be done by enhancing natural capital assets. Now, this is a dangerous territory because many people think that, of course, people will promise to do net biodiversity gain, and then, 5 years down the track, the company have changed, everyone are reneged on it, and we'll move on and, oh, well, so what, we've got the jobs. That isn't good enough. And when one thinks about damage, then we really have to think about not just what offsets any damage, carbon offsets, for example. We have to think too about how we're going to continue to prove that those offsets are being delivered in excess of the damage that was estimated in the first place. And the trouble in this territory, and I've seen it elsewhere in building projects, is the building industry is very good at paying very high sums of money to consultants who come up with results whose objective might charitably be described as think about the smallest number the damage could amount to, because of course the developer will then have to pay the costs of that damage. The less damage, the less costs. This isn't good enough. And every respectable developer, every respectable project understands that they have to have genuinely credible assessments of any damage that might be done and against the natural capital baseline. So that's the important point. But now, how do you ensure in perpetuity that these developments are going to be met? I'll give you an example from elsewhere. People say, don't worry about flying off to the Costa or wherever it is when you're going to be allowed to do so through an airport. Don't worry about that. We're going to plant some trees somewhere. Really? Okay. Which trees? Where? What is the total effect of those trees? How the hell do you know in 30 years' time those trees are still going to be there? Well, the answer is you have to think about mechanisms to ensure that that's in place. And we have all sorts of ways in which we bequeath to next generation assets which are forced to be delivered. We have trusts, we have foundations. In my Green and Prosperous Land book, I suggested there should be trusts of the form of nature funds, etc. But I think it's really important not just to think that you might be able to compensate, but to prove that you've done it and think about how that's going to be channeled. LEP, the National Park, lots of people have a stake in this, but credibility, and particularly credibility with the local people, is based upon not just promising to deliver, but actually delivering at the other end. Which brings me to the last bit I wanted to cover, which is how the hell is all this lot going to get paid for? Right? Now, if you've got really big developments, which are part and parcel of that frame, of course, they're part and parcel of that calculation. This is net gain at a landscape level, or at least at a wider local level than the particular project. And Aldred suggested some dimensions of this. If there are developments and free ports, all that kind of stuff, then it's not acceptable that any of these things happen unless the net natural capital is better by a significant margin than would have otherwise been the case. But we also have to be creative here. There are lots of different revenue funds which people are only just beginning to understand. The carbon offset market at the corporate level is potentially huge. I have grave reservations about the way some of it's being done. I'm really scared about the potential for greenwashing in all of this, but there's no doubt whatsoever that any and every significant company in your area, if they haven't already done it, are going to declare their net zero targets, and they're going to give a date. And I say I have grave reservations about quite a lot of greenwashing that's going on. But a straightforward approach to this in your area is, okay, let's look at every company with a net zero target, and let's look at every company that won't hit the deadline that they have in mind, and let's look at the aggregate of all the carbon offsets that would be required by those companies in the normal practice of their businesses. This isn't new developments, this is just in their normal day-to-day business, and think about how to pool that for the whole area. That could be a really big sum of money, and that could be a huge opportunity within the area. That's new. That's additional money to all the other things that have been thought about so far and should be on top of any enhancements because of damage and any of the other component parts. And if you look at the new forest in particular, but you also look at the coastal fringe, the carbon sequestration potential is very large, and also the current carbon natural capital stocks are very big too. I've been currently looking at Chichester Harbour, and it's quite extraordinary what could be absorbed in carbon terms by treating the salt marshes properly and having some vision about what might be achieved. That's one thing. The Environment Bill, of course, changes the incentives for all landowners. They're no longer going to be paid for owning land. As I described it in my book, this is the crazy economics of farming at the moment. We're moving into public goods. Well, the public good that's most important here is the natural capital of this area, and all farmers will, even in the tier 1 sustainable farming incentive, have to think what they're going to contribute. Again, the important bit is contribute not just to their bit of land, but to the overall plan of the area in which can be captured the natural capital systems in the baseline and the enhancement of it. So we've got the agriculture bill, we've got the climate change carbon offsets, we've got separate grants for planting trees. If you listen to the Today programme this morning, you'll see another batch of tree planting subsidies, this time coming through the forestry organisations. They're all up there. And then on top of that, we've got to think about the revenues to be contributed from the wider industrial base, of which tourism is an extremely important part. And it's always seemed to me incredible that we can have in key parts of our natural capital, which most of the national parks are a big part of, we can have footprints without any contribution. It's not that we want to tax people for using natural capital. On the contrary, the whole point of natural capital is to get people to use it. But we have to think about how people in using natural capital can contribute to its maintenance and its enhancement going forward. And if you look at the development in your area, if you think the footfall on the national park is big now, wait for another 20, 30 years and think what the footfall will be as people appreciate what's available to them going forward. So I think there are serious revenue streams out there. I think they fit together in the overall natural capital systems that are there. This is a wider nature, not just recovery system, but set of natural assets. The key thing is to think about these various contributions. Within that, look at the baseline to prove that things are getting better. And of course, identify capital maintenance that's required to catch up, and to look at the big opportunities there are to make this area the thriving industrial hub, the thriving new tech hub, the thriving port hub, and the thriving natural capital hub. And those things should be mutually reinforcing. Because if they're not, then we'll go back to the old 20th century argument that basically it's the economy versus nature. We can't afford that. We owe the next generation a better set of outcomes. And in any event, it's not sustainable, and therefore it won't be sustained. Thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Dieter. We asked you to challenge us, and I think you've very much done that and also inspired us, for which we're hugely grateful. And we're actually going to run a few questions now, if that's okay, because a few of them have come into the chat. So what we'll do is to sort of bring those in between speakers so that we don't have to wait till the end, and also because we've got you at the moment to help us answer some of those questions. So Paul, would you like to just give Dieter a couple of the questions that have come through so we could start some of the dialogue? Aldred, we might ask you to sort of comment as well, if that's okay.
Yeah, thank you, Alison. Thank you, Dieter. And thank you, everybody who's put their questions in the chat. I'm going to sort of try and group them up a little bit so that I won't necessarily be answering your or asking your specific question. But Dieter, one of the key ones, I think, is how do we balance the financial and environmental sustainability in the local area? You mentioned in your in your presentation the presence of the, or potential presence of, the desalination plant, and certainly we have people here on the conference today who are concerned about that. So how do we sort of tackle the fact that high carbon footprints and particular projects could have potentially negative environmental impacts?
Okay, let me take that. And I do apologise again for the appalling state of the university's infrastructure, but hopefully you can still hear me. The desal plant is an example of the consequences of the stress that's being put in the Solent area and in the southeast on water resources. And we have to remember that climate change is going to happen. It is happening, and therefore it is going to change the demands on, not just the water supplies, but the whole energy system of the area. And of course, it's going to put big stresses on the national park and the existing biodiversity. And so, it's a capital maintenance question, just to hold the line and adapt to what's coming. And just in case you doubt it, between now and 2025, we're going to cross the 1.5 degree warming line with a 40% probability. All this stuff about we're just having these great plans, it's all going to be fine, it's cakeism, it's don't have to worry about bunny huggers, it's all fine and dandy on the climate change side. It's nonsense. And that's why I wrote my net zero book. You're going to get climate change, you're going to have to adapt to it. There is no industrial technological base to your area. There's no prosperity for people in your area, and there's no prosperity for the environment unless it adapts. Sea level is going to rise. It is already rising by millimeters per year. Okay, and that's going to go on to 250, whether people like it or not. So if you take the desal plant, okay, you've got various things you can say. First of all, what's the alternative? How are people going to have water in your area sufficient to their demands and not build a desal plant? That's always where I start. What's the alternative? How else could we do this? Okay. Now, of course, there's a hell of a lot of things we could do. The state of the water systems in the south and southeast is pretty dire. I've been doing this work on Chichester Harbour. If you look at the flows, Aldred mentioned nutrients. That's just part of it. You look at what's going on, it's just not good. Okay, and we have fast runoff. That's why we have all the sewage overflows taking place, the storm overflows, even in summer. Okay. Now, the second thing to say is, if you look globally, most of the world's population live in cities, and most of the big cities are on the coast. And virtually around the world, none of them have adequate medium-term water supplies. So if you look globally, desal is coming big time. The question isn't whether desal is a good idea, it's the energy footprint of that. It's whether you could do that with zero carbon energy. Okay, and that's a hell of an ask, right? A really big ask. And so the challenge here is you can't just pretend there isn't a water supply problem. There is, right? There will need to be new supplies. There will need to be better conservation of what's there. Model this against the alternatives, and then really think not just what a zero carbon project for Fawley is, which is what Aldred pointed to, but think about it for the whole region. And I would just say in passing, isn't it extraordinary that all these 300,000 houses being built a year, none of them, or virtually none of them so far, are even zero carbon, let alone changing the existing housing stock. So I would argue you need to integrate the energy and transport systems with the natural capital. But then that's my whole view. Natural capital is one of the capitals, the most important capital, to think of any economic plan, any frame. And I haven't looked at the carbon plans for the region as a whole, but no disrespect, they'll be found wanting. There's a lot of work to be done because they're wanting everywhere. And remember, 78% by 14 years' time is the current target in law.
Thank you. And we might hear from Anne-Marie in a moment, some of the issues and the challenges that they will have around the Solent LEP for achieving some of those targets. another question, Dieter, is around baselining and the importance or the difficulty of a number of the ecosystems perhaps being in a critical state and this sort of shifting baseline syndrome. Are we confident that the baselines that we have now will be sufficient for us to sort of improve that natural capital going forward, or are we already in a critical state and have dropped below a baseline level in effect?
Okay, so there are two different things going on here. One is the current environment a good environment, or would we prefer it to be better? That's one question. The second question is knowing what's actually there now, right? Now, the point of baseline is not to say it's optimal in any sense of the word. It's simply to say, if you don't know what you've got, you won't know when it's gone, right? And it's to stop greenwash, right? People say, oh, I've seen lots of butterflies, you know, or people go to the countryside and they see a green field. I was in Exmoor last weekend, and you know, some really vivid green grass, right? Well, sheep have been grazed on right next to the moor, and you say that's environmentally awful. People don't understand that, right? Because it's just had loads and loads of nitrogen applied to it in areas where it shouldn't happen. So the baseline isn't about saying anything at all about what's desirable. It's simply saying we are where we are. Let's make sure scientifically we know exactly where that is. Okay. Now, is that good enough? I doubt it very much. It's not probably consistent with net zero, and it's probably not consistent with any of the 4 targets that are going to be statutory. So that's why I say this is just a tool in order to say, okay, so how can we make it better? I put aside whether you want to get back to 1950 or 1872. I think the situation is sufficiently serious that we want to ignore that discussion, simply say what improves the system going forward. That's what I say the is a tool switch enhancements. So instead of saying, I've got this great idea, wouldn't it look lovely? And the flowers. Instead, let's say, okay, what precisely do you propose to do? And what will the natural capital system look like? I think that's why we need to use those baselines to go forward. And that's why we need to do this scientifically, because it eventually comes down to the horrible characteristic of the dismal scientists, of economists like me. Money is short. We want to make sure that whatever money is used to the best possible effect. And the only way of doing that, if you're running a business, you'd say, if I put this factory up, what will happen to my market? What will happen to my share of sector? What will my profits be? Well, you just think the same way about natural capital. You know, what's the gain going to come from this? So let's do it that way, but not optimal, of course not. But, you know, we're not going back to 1930 again anytime soon. And actually, it's a different world. We just got to make a century tick.
Thank you, and apologies, I lost the connection on that, so but I'm back now. One final question that might put to both yourself and Dieter, to yourself and Aldred. Question about sort of public engagement. There's lots of comments in the chat about how the public can properly engage with the natural capital vocabulary, with the discipline, if you like. You mentioned in your presentation that credibility with local people will be essential. And I wonder, perhaps if you respond to that, when Aldred might also think about, with his development being so critical to the Forley waterside area, his thoughts around public credibility around this whole issue.
Okay, so the good news is that for a big swathe of the public, they've got it, in the sense of they've got natural capital and they've got net zero. They've been told it won't cost them anything in net zero, that it's all cakeism, but never mind. At a different level, and opinion polls show this, people have at least understood there is an issue out there which they didn't think 10 years ago was that important. Okay, and a load of people have been out in the countryside who've never been there before, some of them actually grossly irresponsible. The Nature Reserve for the Wildlife Trust I'm a vice president of down the road last summer had a horrendous experience of people deciding to wild camp over the whole damn thing, with a lot of damage. But actually, I keep saying, so what? You know, these people have engaged. We've got to educate them to use natural capital better. Link back to the baseline. The point of the baseline is not just a tool for smart people like you on this video call to think about what's on offer, but to demonstrate what the benefits would be to people if we did certain things. Okay, so I see the tool of the baseline and the enhancement modeling a way of capturing as a result of the kinds of things which you can offer the future. And I always say to people, if you want something to work and you want to take the public with you, tell them what the prize is. Give them a picture of this area in 2030 and maybe 2040, but 2030, a decade is the way people think. What could my local environment be like in 10 years' time? What could the street outside my house look like? What would the green spaces be? What would be available to me in the national park that I otherwise might not have had? Will I be able to use the seafront and see the marshes? You know, what will be there for my kids? So I would emphasize to you, spell out the prize, this vision of what you want to achieve, and then use the tools of baselines and enhancement modeling to show the content of that, to do it as efficiently as possible. But unless people can see the prize, that net zero is an exact example of capturing people's imagination. They actually believe that when we get to net zero, we'll no longer be causing climate change. It's actually nonsense. We'll still be importing loads of stuff, and we've been maintaining our carbon consumption pretty much constant while we've been reducing our carbon production. But that's a whole another thing in my net zero book. But for the moment, just think what captures people's imagination. Think of the vision, think of the prize. And Aldred has some of that in those slides he showed with the maps of what this is supposed to look like. Just make sure that people say, oh, you would say that, wouldn't you? To which he replies, no, we're going to keep running the baseline. We're going to show, demonstrate that we're achieving what we said we were going to achieve, and then you're going to get that benefit.
Thank you, Dieter. Aldred, I just wonder if you have a few thoughts on this issue.
Thanks, Paul. And building on what Dieter said, I think it's something that articulated and demonstrated in the right way is something that everybody can engage with. The whole community can engage with this. And this is why I think it is so partially so exciting. It doesn't matter whether you're in a flat in Southampton or you're living in the middle of the New Forest. You can really engage with this agenda. And we can use technology to engage people even more. You know, if we had video cams, for example, of terns nesting on a new island in the middle of the Solent, you'd be able to give people real-time interactive relationship with biodiversity in action. So I think there's a huge vision, there's a huge prize, and there's a huge easy engagement. You know, you've only got to see what one of our greatest national treasures, almost on the same parallel with the Queen, is now David Attenborough. You know, what he has done through his 50 years of cinematography has really got nature into people's living rooms. And I think we need to build on that. And as Dieter says, having the ability to use natural capital assessments is a bit like a report and accounts. That's the way I look at it, is that we have to be accountable. We have to keep on reviewing this and presenting, or I would say on an annual basis, to demonstrate how we are improving the natural capital. And it's not going to be, you know, dramatic increase every single year. You know, there's going to need to be intelligence to say that this is a long-term process, but the goal in 2030, 2040, 2050 is ever increasing biodiversity gain. And as long as we're sort of realistic about it, and I think, you know, the Freeport, I come back, and I know we've got Anne-Marie Mounterfield next, gives us this opportunity to catalyse that. And I think one of the most exciting things that will come out, and again was raised by Dieter, is this commitment from big business or any business to hit net zero or over a certain time frame. We can capture that. We have projects that we can put together that we can effectively sell to those corporations. And if we have a proper accountability methodology, we can be accountable to them to just like any investment in the stock market and the annual reporting or biannual reporting. That's exactly what we should be doing. We're saying, we're taking your money and we're doing this, or we're taking your interest public, not your money, but perhaps we are because through your tax revenues, and we're doing this. And this is what we're going to continue to do. And as long as we continue to do that, we'll keep the public engaged, and then we will actually manage to achieve the goal or the vision. So I think that all of this is inextricably linked. We have a really, and we've been engaged, you know, this Green Halo thing's been going on for 5 years. We have all of the parties, all of the relevant groupings here, very heavily engaged in this process. And I would say, I mean, Dieter, much wider experience, but I would say that's fairly unique to have that sort of concentration of involvement within the New Forest area to actually make this happen. With big business, with some large landowners, the largest landowner of them all is the Forestry Commission, who own the national park. And the one area we mustn't forget is the sea and the foreshore. Because as I said, there's Chichester Harbour, which is a vast one, but the Southampton Solent marshes from Lymington right up to the Itchen and Tests, you know, are enormous areas that could be a significant carbon sequestration projects in their own right. So I'm very excited. And I think we should, my one last pitch would be, I'm promoting a new island on the Bramble Bank. I'm not sure how feasible it is, but I think that would be a good idea as a location for arisings from dredging, which must continue, but also therefore a large new nature resource that we don't need to visit, but we can visit. We can visit virtually and see every year how we're improving things. Thank you.
Thank you, Aldred. When you mentioned that to me before, I said, you know, you have to compete with the cricketers who like to play a match, I think, when it gets exposed. But I mean, I think these big ideas are the ones that we really need to tell the stories of. I think storytelling, giving the words to each other to use with each other and with our communities that clarify where we want to go. And if that vision is compelling enough, people will go, they will take the leap. So I'm hugely grateful to you, Dieter, for helping us clarify some of that thinking. And we're going to move to Anne-Marie now, who I introduced earlier, the Chief Executive of the Solent LEP. And I know how passionate she is also about the themes that we've been hearing about. So Anne-Marie, I ask you to, if you'd like to take the stage for the next 5 minutes. We'll then move on to Lane Harmiston from Bournemouth University. He's going to give us some insights into how the health and well-being aspects of this can and should be taken forward in the next period. And then we'll pause again for a few questions. So Anne-Marie, over to you. So can we get your sound, Anne-Marie, is that okay?
Sam, I think we might need to unmute Anne-Marie from the centre here.
Thank you. We'll let you know when we can hear you, Anne-Marie, when the mute comes off. I mean, yes, interesting. This is what unites us though at the moment, isn't it? Technology challenges is one of our common causes. There we are. We've got some slides. Great. We can't hear Anne-Marie yet. Is there any way of unmuting Anne-Marie? Paul, do we have any?
I gather that Anne-Marie, you need to unmute yourself. So I don't. I'm getting suggestions that the issue is at your end rather than ours, I'm afraid.
What we could do while we try and resolve that is go straight to Lane if he's willing, because I know he doesn't have slides.
Hi, Rachel. I'm very willing.
Okay, should we do that and then
Okay.
see if we can resolve? Anne-Marie, are you happy for us to do that? Is that okay with you? Great. Okay, let's do that. So 5 minutes, please, Lane. Great to have you with us, and over to you.
Lovely. Thank you, Rachel. I've got to say I was super encouraged by what I've heard this morning. And just a bit of reflection on what I've heard. Dieter mentioned around I had here around capturing people's imagination, around really connect people with the prize for this change. And I do think health and well-being is that golden egg. It's the thing that we experience in every breath. So I think there's something about what means something to people immediately right now. And again, for me, that's health and well-being. So what I'd like to do, if I can, in the next 5 minutes, is explore the health and well-being a little bit, introduce the Bournemouth, the Nature Health Network, which was catalysed by the Green Halo a couple of years ago, and just some ideas about going forward. Our relationship with nature actually has been symbiotic for millennia. I think it's our sort of our evolutionary umbilical cord, if that makes sense to people. Our evolutionary home. And even though it's been thousands of years, we've had a bit of a rough relationship the last couple of hundred. And I think we've really got an opportunity now to really bring that marriage back together if we possibly can. Hippocrates said in 460 BC that nature is our best physician. And I think more than ever now, especially we mentioned around the nature recovery system or crisis, we have that with society as well at the moment. And I think we've really seen that, especially in the first couple of lockdowns, how people naturally start to develop that relationship again. And I think that's something we should really sort of build on. 1951, with the obviously the birth of the national parks, that was all about breathing life back into our nation as a recovery from the Second World War. So it seems like we respond or return to nature when there's a need for recovery. And I think we're in that position right now. I think we find ourselves right now here. And we've really experienced that with the development or the growth of a Nature Health Network, which has really brought together 200 organisations the last 10 months. And as I said before, that was the Green Halo Partnership was a catalyst for that a couple of years ago. So we have organisations from healthcare, from businesses, from education, from community, from public services, who are now really recognising the value of nature and connection with nature. And that's not only necessarily the sort of magisterial landscapes of the national parks, but that can also maybe be the plant pot on the windowsill. And to give you an example, we ran a session a month or so ago, where we had phone calls of people who were shielding, isolate, to look out of their window and look into their garden. We guided them around their garden on a phone, and for them to connect through their senses. So this may not necessarily be around everyone having to go into step into the traditional model of nature. It's really using this opportunity, using, I think, I would say Green Halo and the national parks to amplify, to champion, and maybe mentor people to develop that connection, whether that's through education, especially in healthcare. We're seeing it very much in healthcare at the moment, and really help forge those relationships. And I've got to be honest with you, my experience or my education around net carbon, etc., whatever, is reasonably illiterate. I've got to be honest with you from that perspective. I'm more in the community health and well-being, but I could see how this could really act as a conduit. The Green Halo could really bring together the element of societal health and well-being on an individual public basis, but also the environment and Yes, and the communities coming together. So I think this would be a fantastic platform for that. So I think really from my point of view, or from what I've seen this morning, I can totally understand or see the precedence and the importance of climate change and how we need to make those shifts. But also going back to what Dieter was saying around winning their hearts and minds and emotionally connecting with people in their communities, and them to redeveloping that relationship with nature, that love with nature, that means then that they will probably take more care of it and have a better relationship from it. I think health and well-being can really play a part in that if we can amplify that. So that's really my reflection. I would like to take the opportunity to thank everyone who supported the development of the Nature Health Network, and I'll put those details in the chat. There has been Public Health England, there has been National Parks, and our healthcare professionals as well from Public Health who've supported that. Yeah, that's really it from me, apart from, if I may, just leave you with some life lessons from a tree, just for you individually as well. So it's really for you to take away from this meeting as well. Stand tall and proud, go out on a limb, reach for the sky, and maybe that's part of this, what we're trying to do now. Remember your roots, drink plenty of water, be content with your natural beauty, and enjoy the view. So again, I'm happy to take questions later on, but if we can really, like I say, develop this health and well-being relationships, I think that's something we could do through the Green Halo Partnership. Thank you, Rachel.
Thanks, Lane. So it's Alison. I know you've been speaking to Rachel.
Alison, sorry,
I thought I'd just highlight that because everybody will wonder who I am then. Thank you. I mean, I think this is particularly fantastic that you and colleagues from the health sector have continued to work on this in what has been the most challenging of years for you all. And I just want to echo my thanks particularly to Public Health England, Health Education England, all of our NHS colleagues for all they have done for us over the last year and continue to do, but at the same time actually dedicating their efforts into thinking about reaching for the sky. So thank you very much, Lane. I think we're now ready to move to Anne-Marie. So shall we go for that? Anne-Marie, over to you.
Still can't hear you, Anne-Marie.
What a shame. Yeah, okay. So what to do, really?
Well, John Donnell could step in at this point, Alison, if John's ready.
Okay, is John ready?
I am ready. If you can hear and see me.
Yeah. Okay, right. Well, John, we're really grateful for you joining us today. So John Donnell is from the Hampshire and Isle Wildlife Trust. And you'll see in the chat, and I mentioned earlier that the Trust has been really taking leadership on nature recovery with their amazing Wilder 2030 strategy, which was launched in 2019. And John himself has been a really key, thought leader, inspiration for that, having worked in our area for 24 years. And also we're really grateful and lucky that he also is based in the New Forest himself and has participated greatly in the thinking around the national park and where that can go as a partnership together. So no one better than to give us a 5-minute perspective, sorry, only 5 minutes, but on our nature sort of strand, our wildlife challenges going forward. John.
Thank you, Alison. I'm sure there are many people better, but I will take that as a compliment. I shall just try and bring my my slides up. If not, I shall. Is that visible to everybody at the moment?
Yep, we can see it.
Great stuff. So thank you very much for allowing me to quickly respond to the fabulous presentation that Dieter made. Very very interesting and thought-provoking. I just thought I would start with using our nitrate mitigation scheme as a model of probably how things can work, but also the limitations that the current sort of approaches bring. So I'll just see if I can move on. Oh dear, it doesn't want to move. Let me just. Oh, my slide appears to be stuck, which isn't great. Let me just see if, good stuff. So just quickly referring to the issues that nitrate pollution has caused in the Solent, and actually anybody who's been involved in development and economic development in the south of Hampshire over the last 2 or 3 years will know the problems that this has caused for economic growth and development in the Solent. So basically, long-term nitrate pollution into our water bodies has led to eutrophication of the Solent, and that's created this sort of enormous mat of green algae that now covers much of the internationally important habitats that we see off our coast. Now, this problem has built up over many years, and it is not a problem that is uniquely caused by development. Indeed, probably the majority of the cause has been agricultural runoff over an extended period of time. But I think what this shows is that damage to the environment, however caused, has the potential to hamper a whole range of other desirable outcomes that people have, as well as impacting on biodiversity. I mean, our intertidal areas in the Solent are phenomenally important for biodiversity, but they're also, as Dieter sort of touched on with Chichester Harbour, potentially huge carbon sinks. And this damage caused by this eutrophication is really hampers the ability of these intertidal habitats to sequester carbon. And obviously that has a potentially significant long-term impact. In fact, we are doing an R&D project on blue carbon with a number of partners in the Solent to look at the potential for blue carbon. So it's one of the things that we're also looking at, because obviously intertidal habitats are fantastically good for wildlife, but they're coast-specific with their ability to absorb carbon. And I think, you know, one of the things here is it shows that damage to the environment, the natural environment, is very, very costly and difficult to mitigate for, to put right. And we need really to try and make sure that damage is not accruing, because it has a potential to impact our long-term strategies, but it's also very difficult to put right. So the Trust has a scheme where we're looking to secure land, take it out of intensive farm production, reduce nitrates going into the Solent, and lead to mitigation. And the driver for this is clearly the sort of habitat regs and the Dutch nitrate case. But I think in some ways what this also does, and our scheme sort of illustrates, is that while we can deliver lots of wildlife gain, we can take land, we can create fabulous habitats, and we can deliver reduction, there is a limit, because the real driver remains a sort of legislative approach, which is really about mitigating. So the test is no net increase in nutrient neutrality, as it were. Now that really smacks of a chronic lack of ambition. I sort of quickly looked up the term mitigation, a definition before today, and the definition of mitigation is action of reducing severity, seriousness, or painfulness of something. Now I think, over the last 20, 30 years, the sort of model for addressing impacts on wildlife has really been on that sort of do no harm to the really rare, the really protected sites or the protected species. And clearly what that has led to, in the teeth of that economic model that Professor Helm referred to, is a continual reduction in wildlife that we see and continual damage. And so what we've really seen is possibly the rare being held in as rare, but we've also now seen the common become unusual and the unusual become common, because they don't fit into that model. So I suppose my sort of plea is for ambition, and it's great listening to Aldred and his discussion and looking at his project and his discussion about the Rotterdam expansion, and also we're working with Gary Wilburn on some other smaller developments in the area that we look at. We're looking at a new scheme where the Trust is about to launch a Building with Nature project, where we look to embed wildlife and sustainability right at the planning stage, rather than having wildlife and the natural environment being viewed as a constraint to overcome. It really needs to be seen as an opportunity, an asset to be built in right from the planning stage of every development, no matter how large or small. And I think it's that ambition that is really exciting for us. Our WADA 2030 strategy called for 30% of land and sea to be managed for wildlife over the next, by 2030. And that, that's not just saying, well, we've got a couple of large national parks in Hampshire, the job's done, because the evidence suggests that that's not always the case. We need land and sea to be actually actively managed for the benefit of wildlife. And I think the other thing that I think we need to think about is to be super ambitious as well about that involvement with the community, providing people with really exciting opportunities to access wildlife. One of the things I'd love to call for is the creation of a series of new country parks that are attractive places to go, of scale, of the kind that were created in the 60s and 70s, Queen Elizabeth Country Park, Royal Vic, Wellington Country Park. A whole range of parks were created then that public used and actually engaged with wildlife on the most basic sort of scale. So it's really important, I think, that ambition and our ambition for 30% of land and sea, but also an ambition to have built environments that are brilliant for wildlife. And I think one of the reasons that we've not been ambitious about our built environment is we haven't realised how important they are for wildlife over the past 20 or 30 years. And actually, in some ways, it's quite easy to take a farmland that is intensively managed, as you see in the top left, and create wildflower meadows that absorb carbon and do fabulous things for pollinators and common farmland birds, and that's super important. Frankly, I think if we can create habitats for invertebrates and sort out the massive loss of the base of the biodiversity pyramid, if you like, the thing that feeds everything else, then everything else will follow. Birds will follow if we provide them with food, and I think that's really, really important, to not just concentrate on the rare. That's really important, and protecting rare habitats is super important, and protecting our scarce species is super important. But creating wildlife rich landscapes where the common can become commoner and the unusual become less unusual is really important. So, my final thoughts, I suppose, are there was some chat about involving people and how people become involved, and I think Dieter's comment about most people have got it is absolutely true. And I think this is demonstrated by the fact that there was a survey done by, I think, the Pet Food Manufacturers Association in 2019. And 41% of people with an outside space feed birds. So I think the public already get it. They already feel that having wildlife close to them and exciting, attractive, wildlife-rich gardens and workspaces are integral to their well-being. There's a huge altruism in that, of course, but there's also a self-fulfilling sort of requirement to feel close to nature. And also, we look at our sort of wetland habitats. There's about 3.5 million ponds in the UK. 3 million of those are in gardens. People spend money and time and effort to do things that bring wildlife close to them. And our urban environments are now phenomenally important for wildlife, for birds, for insects, for amphibians, for reptiles. And I think when we realise that, we realise the importance of building in wildlife into our built environment, as well as restoring wildlife into our rural environment. So I think my final thought would be ambition. Lots of it, big country parks, wildlife-rich urban areas, and 30% of land and sea for wildlife. So thank you very much.
Thanks, John. That's wonderful. Passionate as always. I'm still hoping that everyone in our area will get a nature break as well as a coffee break in their contract.
I like that.
So I'd like to hand back to Dieter actually, because I know that he does have to leave in a few minutes' time. There are a few questions, Dieter, I'm sure you've seen them, about the consequences of connection with nature, such as litter. I know we can probably list a very long list of impacts. I wonder if you could just make some final comments about those points and anything further you'd like to say before you leave us.
Thank you very much. I can now tell you also the university's network has recovered completely. As of the way. Right, very quickly. I'm sorry I have to go hard deadline at 1:15. But I wanted to make a number of comments. The impact side, the litter, etc. I don't know if anyone saw the pictures at the side of Loch Lomond in Scotland. You know, people who've got no experience of the countryside come out, and the rest of us might be completely horrified by the mess that's left. It just shows us what an educational job there is to do. It's just the case that for many people, they don't actually see the connection between what they do, how they behave, and what the environmental effects will be. So it's an opportunity to engage, as opposed to keep off my land, private land, go away attitudes. So I think it's a big problem, especially with the intensity that you've got in the New Forest. But there are a few other points I want to pick up. The comments from, I think it was John, the last comments, stress something which I think gets forgotten. I've been trying to stress the system nature of this, how the bits fit together. That's really important. But the system goes right down to what's in your backyard. So these efforts of backyard biodiversity, getting kids in little communities to see if they can get a hedgehog back, you know, if they can just plant some wildflowers, if they can let something go wild. This is a real engagement opportunity. And, you know, why are we doing all this? It's not actually for us, at least not for me. I'm of a particular generation. This is for the kids. This is for what they're going to get. So I think you should be incredibly micro as well as very macro in doing this. And just on the macro side, the point about blue carbon and the point about air quality in the previous two really fascinating contributions. This just shows how it fits together. You know, air quality and climate change are not unrelated, and air quality and nutrients are not unrelated. There's a huge amount of air pollution, which we just look at carbon dioxide and we don't worry about these other stuff, right? What do you think the ammonia is doing, right? What's the agricultural blow off? You know, what's the deposits that come from that? So we need to see that together. And the air quality bit, almost everything you can think of, which will do stuff about climate change, to transport, to energy systems, etc., will improve air quality. Right? And what we found in the Natural Capital Committee is the environmental gains from improvement of air quality and measured economic value are greater than all the others put together. We were startled by that. On the blue carbon, you know, we have to see that the Solent is not just a series of land around it and some nice trees. It's those mudflats, the point that Aldred made too. They are huge carbon sinks that aren't properly measured yet. They will be. And what happens upriver in the Test and the Itchen, what the nutrient flows are, affects the ability to provide clean water to people, the cost in people's water bills of cleaning up the mess, the demands on total capacity, and the capacity of the mud to absorb it. And that's where I think this prize of an integrated net zero program for the frame and the monies that go with that provide great opportunity. Wouldn't it be fantastic if many of the local businesses committed to net zero actually were saying, you know what, and we're going to do something about the mudflats? Wouldn't that be inspiring? Wouldn't that be educational? So I'll leave you with those thoughts, but thank you very much, and let me wish you well. It's someone else made a point earlier. I don't know of any other group like this nationwide, and I don't know any other group that's so engaged. But I suspect, given the big projects, the big stuff you've got, the population, you should be in the front. You ought to be in the front. And if I could just add my voice to it, you ought to be even more ambitious than you currently are. But thank you very much for listening to me, and I'm sorry about the internet connections earlier on.
Thank you so much, Dieter. We so appreciate your time and your forbearance with the systems, which we're all struggling with. It's just been inspirational to have you with us. You've really helped us to look forward. We've got an awful lot to think about, and I hope we can bring you in over that journey and certainly not disappoint you. So we wish you well and thank you once more.
Thank you.
So now I think we can hand back to Anne-Marie to give us a perspective from the LEP. We'll then be turning to Joseph Owen, who's a PhD student at Southampton University, who's been working with me on something called the Green Print for South Hampshire, which, as many of you will know, is an attempt to get towards this sort of balanced scorecard approach for authorities in our region. But of course, Joseph is also what might be termed a young person, which always makes him laugh, I know. And I think he's going to give us a bit of a kind of perspective to finish about what his generation would like to see. So that's what we've got up next. So Anne-Marie, fingers crossed, over to you.
Good morning, everybody. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can. Hooray.
Thank you very much, and apologies. If everybody is comfortable, I'm going to screen share and hope that goes slightly better than the mic issues. So can colleagues see the slides?
Yeah.
All good?
Yeah.
Excellent. So very quick canter through. Thank you very much for inviting me this morning. We at the Solent LEP are sort of moving through to publish our Solent 2050 strategy. And just to pick up on some of the points earlier about the economy over climate no longer holds, totally agree with that. And very much at the forefront of the vision for the new strategy is to be innovative in our work to adapt to climate change here in the Solent, and actually to spearhead a revolution in sort of economic growth. And in broad terms, what we've identified are a number of strategic priorities. We've engaged with over 2,000 organisations over 18 months to arrive at a set of key priorities. Many of them probably feature in a number of strategies across the country. But, you know, what I'd like to talk about this morning are sort of three areas that I think have featured through the conference today. So one is there is very much an ambition that we should pioneer approaches to climate change, adaptation and decarbonisation, and be real national and global leaders that others can learn from and use our region as a showcase. And in that regard, I think there is very much a role that the visitor economy and the creative and cultural economy can play, capitalising on the superb natural beauty that we have in the region. And another feature that I think I've heard this morning, which reassures us at the LEP, health and well-being is at the heart of economic success. It's not just a jobs driven strategy. It must be a strategy that delivers a sustainable future for everybody, and the areas of health and well-being feature very much in that. And I think we have reflected on the longer term implications of COVID as well as the short term. So I think everybody has spoken at some point this morning about the impact it's having today. We are looking at tomorrow and the future, and we do see a paradigm shift in the approach to growth. That's very much focused on the promotion of environmental awareness and green recovery. I'll talk a little bit about that. It's also about embedding health and well-being into any plans we have for the future. And one that I'm particularly passionate about is levelling up opportunity. And I was really heartened to hear Dieter and colleagues from Hampshire Isle Wildlife Trust talk about the importance of natural capital to people in their homes and in their own immediate environments. We're very conscious within the Solent LEP area. We have some highly densely populated areas where people don't automatically have access to the natural capital that the area has within it, and we're very keen to look at ways to sort of tackle that. In terms of the challenges, I think I'm probably reiterating some of the many points colleagues have made this morning. The Solent has an exceptionally strong natural capital offering. I'm always very cognizant of the fact that when I'm in cross-country engagements with other LEPs, we have such a fabulous array of natural assets, and we can hold our own in any conversation. And that, coupled with the coastal location, and we do have a world-class environment, it would be really difficult to justify why this shouldn't be the centrepiece of our Solent 2050 strategy. And all that we're looking at in terms of growth, particularly in some of our key sectors such as marine and maritime, will be dependent on the quality of the natural environment, will be dependent on maintaining that outstanding coastline, and also does thrive because nature has given us some great gifts, including the double tides and the sheltered havens on the Southampton water, and we need to embrace those gifts and look after them. So it is a great strength, but I think, as Dieter and others talked about earlier, we are exposed to challenge, particularly in relation to climate change. I haven't got an exhaustive list here. I just wanted to showcase some of the things we are working with partners, many of them on this call. So air quality has been mentioned. The sort of carbon footprint of some of our industries has been referenced, and we also have some natural challenges around coastal erosion and flooding, all of which feature in not just the extension of natural capital assets, but I think, as Dieter talked about earlier, looking after the existing ones. Hence, the coastal erosion and flooding is an area that we are looking at. So where does that bring us to? What we will be bringing out in the Solent 2050 plan? I must apologise, as I was reconnecting and looking at this slide, the COP26 is this year. That's a typo on my part, so my apologies for that. But what you will see come through in the strategy are three ambitions, three strategic opportunities that, working with partners in the Solent region, we want to look at in order to address some of the challenges I've just mentioned. So making sure that the Solent is an integral part of the carbon energy supply chain. Dieter talked about infrastructure earlier, and infrastructure being integrated as opposed to being separated. I think the Solent has a real role to play in terms of carbon energy supply, and we are seeing some early signs of interest from some major infrastructure providers who recognise the scale of the assets that we have in the Solent and the scale of the opportunity. I think the second area is one about looking at being a preeminent low carbon maritime cluster in Europe. We have a very, very significant array of maritime assets. I know Dieter talked about regulation coming down the line as we speak, and you know, our maritime sector and our maritime businesses want to spearhead change in the sort of carbon footprint in maritime, and we are seeing some early signs of that, which I'll briefly reference in a minute. And finally, pioneering innovative programs for environmental management, pushing the boundary, so we're not just standing still. And again, I'll talk very briefly about that. So what are we doing? If I look at maritime, we have been working with the Port of Southampton as the local enterprise partnership to bring forward the first commercial shore power technology facility, which we hope will go live later this year to deliver zero emissions. That's seen as a really big step forward. We do have shore power capability within the naval base in Portsmouth, but in terms of commercial ports, this will be a first for the UK, and we see that as a statement of intent of what can move forward. We are working with our partners, Maritime UK Solent, to look at a green print for maritime decarbonisation. I think it builds on the natural capital assessment that Dieter talked about earlier, you know, identifying where we can add value in the short term, start to invest in the medium term so that we reach that sort of pinnacle of zero emissions first. And a good example of that is the ambition of the Port of Portsmouth, who want to become the UK's first zero emission port. So lots to come in that regard. Carbon capture was something that was mentioned earlier. We're very keen to explore opportunities in this. We've just signed a memorandum of understanding with the Environment Agency, which is going to look at blue carbon capture and sequestration, which was mentioned earlier. It's really good to see colleagues from the Hampshire and Isle of Wight Trust on. We're working with them on a rewilding scheme, which will look at various areas of rewilding across the Solent as a sort of investment in strengthening the natural capital and as a recognition of the importance of offsetting any sort of growth that does present potential challenges to the existing natural capital. And obviously working with the New Forest, both the National Park, the District Council, obviously Fawley Waterside, on the natural capital assessment has been a big step, not just in terms of producing an assessment like this, but a big learning piece for us at the LEP and looking at the sort of natural capital of the area, starting with the New Forest to get that baseline that Dieter talked about earlier, in order that we can start to identify key sort of projects or key initiatives that will keep the Solent in a place where they're at the vanguard. There's an ambition to expand that assessment to look at the rest of the Solent, but we've been delighted to be involved in that pioneering first baseline development. And I think I'm going to sort of close with mentioning the Freeport. It's been mentioned a few times this morning. Colleagues may be aware the Solent was one of 8 areas that has been identified by government as Freeport locations, and we're working very hard at the moment to secure that designation. One of the centerpieces in that is this ambition to develop a Green Growth Institute, and fundamentally what sits behind it is trying to bring forward a framework to support our partners and our businesses on that journey to becoming a world leader in maritime decarbonisation. So you'll see that some of the sort of principles that are being developed, and obviously working with colleagues such as Alison and the Partnership for South Hampshire as being vital, and the Green Halo Partnership. There are 4 sort of cornerstones really. One is around seed funding for innovation, for new ideas, to break new ground in this arena. The second is to create test beds so people can try their ideas out, look at that new technology and how it can push the boundary in terms of improving our innovation in the natural environment space. I think the 4th one is super important. Dieter talked about, you know, sustaining, not just maintaining, but sustaining and measuring progress and measuring how we move forward. And I think part of that has to be supporting the green leaders of tomorrow with programs to allow them to build their knowledge of their business, of the wider region, allow them perhaps to step forward and play a role in developing the green economy of the future. And finally, tools for business. We have a fantastic array of businesses, and we're really keen, particularly for our SMEs, to provide a haven, a hub that they can come to as they start to develop their own green plans at a local level. And what I'd like to do in closing, this may go disastrously wrong, is to play a short video from our green leaders of tomorrow and our green leaders of today. Many of you will have made a contribution to this, so I hope you recognise yourselves in it, but I hope it also provides an important segue for our next speaker, because there are some really interesting young voices of tomorrow. So let's see if this works.
You've got this amazing asset, you've got this livable place, you've got this place to die for in terms of the quality of life.
It is a place where you want to live and work and bring up families.
In the future, why can't our region be a national park region?
we can do things that make life greener, healthier and wilder.
How much water do we use? How much power do we use? Can we convert to more sustainable energy sources?
There's a lot of hard work going on at the moment to regenerate this area.
Solent region is the place to be. There will be challenges in the future, but we will be ready with our communities to tackle them.
I feel like in the future things will be better because people are starting to do things about the problem that we have with like climate change and the bad plastic in the environment.
The world's changing so quickly. It's hard to sort of keep up sometimes, but there'll be a lot more sort of new adventures and opportunities open.
Thank you so much.
So I'll unshare my screen at that point. I want to leave you with those voices. They are important voices. I think there was a reference to our Solent 2050 strategy as the LEP. It's our strategy, all of us on this call, all of our young people. And I think there is not just an ambition. I think there's evidence that everybody is emotionally connected to this agenda, irrespective of their age. And I feel really positive that we can play a role in delivering a greener future. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Anne-Marie. I'm sure everybody else has got the goosebumps on the back of their neck when you hear those young people's voices. There are a couple of questions for you, Anne-Marie, in the chat. Would you mind just having a look at them for us? Because we're not going to be able to, with our timing, do it in plenary, if that's okay, Anne-Marie.
Yeah, sure. I'll put some answers in the chat. Thanks, Alison.
Perfect, and definitely worth waiting for with that video. Thank you, and your words. We really appreciate your commitment to moving those agendas forward that we've been talking about today. So we're pretty much there. Obviously, we've had a few technology issues, which has meant that we're slightly behind time. So you're not going to hear me sum up so much at the end. But we do have the opportunity, obviously, to communicate with you afterwards. There's still the Padlet poll there where you can share your ideas about our vision, whether it's the right one for our next 5, 30 years. And, you know, any other ideas that have come out of what you've heard, because I suspect, like me, you will need some time for it all to percolate. So I'm going to hand to Joseph, and pretty much now, Joseph, you're kind of closing the conference. I'll probably say a couple more things at the end, but your final words of the next generation are the ones we're going to leave with pretty much. So over to you.
Thanks, Alison. Can you hear me all right?
Yep, we can.
Great, thank you. Hello to all of the attendees as well. It was a pleasure to work with you, Alison, of course, and Simon Eden and David Hutchinson on the Green Print project, which chimes with much of Green Halo thinking. We achieved a lot by establishing a set of priorities for South Hampshire, which tried to address social, economic and environmental challenges together and emphasise the natural capital assets that our area offers. I know the work is now being undertaken by a very capable doctoral researcher, Rhiannon, who, like myself, is from the University of Southampton. Already, the project has been a crucial component of the successful Solent Freeport bid. I think it's fair to say that greenwashing, flawed and fleeting regional investment is no longer an option, and the Green Print should provide mitigation against this. It was reassuring to hear from Anne-Marie about the Solent Green Growth Institute, for instance. I'd like to thank Aldred Drummond and Professor Helm for the stimulating and suggestive presentations. I've organised my selection of thoughts using 3 broad headings: education, accessibility and urgency. These principles, for want of a better word, strike me as a way of addressing the challenges of sustainable living for the next generation, and a way of thinking through Dieter's proposals. None of this will be profound or new, I don't think, but I've tried to formulate an instinctive response, and hopefully that captures the mindset of a youngish person faced with these issues, which are on the face of it phenomenally complex. So first of all, I'd like to address education. Our generation, which is, I'm a little bit older than the people that are in that video, but you know, sort of within that age range, we must focus on the climate crisis. So it's important to emphasise the changes that anyone can make, whether that's by identifying and capitalising on behavioural shifts, encouraging active travel and low polluting vehicles, or facilitating working remotely on a long-term basis. It's paramount that people understand the environmental impact of their lifestyle choices and consumer habits, be it what food they buy, what clothes they wear, or what pensions they are invested in. Raising awareness is key, and making sure that people possess a global outlook is just as essential. Events such as COP26 have to lead the way. We must encourage those who can change to do so and offset others who cannot so easily. Providing this awareness and the subsequent political mandate it offers will give further legitimacy to governments for combating greenwashing through legislation, and by doing so protecting citizens and consumers as underpinned by statute. The bills being passed by Parliament, referred to by Professor Helm, are an encouraging start. We know changes to individual behaviour alone won't offset emissions to the levels required, but collective buy-in will, at the very least, put pressure on large companies and those in power. Moralising about the emissions produced from individuals and households isn't without merit, but when a Cumbrian coal mine is seemingly approved, for instance, it elicits productive anger in some, but likely breeds despondency, and with that apathy, in others. Governments have to show leadership. As the pandemic indicates, people will broadly abide by the rules in an emergency. Next, an illustration for thinking about accessibility. We must make sure that sustainability schemes are well advertised and well run. Having green initiatives, systems and structures that are affordable and incentivised is vital, such as lowering barriers to delivery for retrofit grants. I'd recount my own experience applying for the Green Homes grant on behalf of my nan, but I've my health and sanity to think about. These schemes need to work properly, be accessible and followed through with conviction. Homes should be sustainable at an affordable price. More broadly, we need price parity across sectors as various as the food, fashion and motor industries. People say they want to live sustainably but can rarely afford to do so consistently. Why should they have to wait? Which brings me finally to the matter of urgency. Our generation will be dealing with the fallout from the failed promises and miscommitments of previous years. Addressing climate anxiety and associated mental health problems will constitute one part of the response. We must also act on the physical health and structural implications of higher temperatures. Access to nature and capital maintenance, as Professor Helm indicated, will be crucial to this. In our region, maintaining quality water supply, restoring flood defences and rewilding are fundamental to future well-being. For many young people, the need to address environmental problems is brute fact. They want to see organisations take responsibility for emissions reductions to reach net zero, and to see governments show competence and leadership on the green agenda. I came to the Green Print project as a relative layperson on green issues. That said, I was amenable to addressing my carbon footprint, thinking hard about increasing biodiversity and the associated costs, and considering the social consequences of environmental damage. I'd suggest that particular attitude among my generation is closer to the rule than it is the exception. There's plenty of goodwill going around to make drastic changes to avert climate and environmental disaster. I think it would take a remarkable act of self-sabotage to waste that goodwill. If those in authority say one thing and do another, particularly at this point, it will disaffect both reasonable and unreasonable people. Hearts and minds have already been won in my generation. Now we just need policies that work, schemes that are properly delivered, and a consistency of message that is impossible to ignore. Thanks for inviting me. Thanks for listening, and thanks to the other brilliant speakers today. And I'll hand you back, Alison.
Thank you so much, Joseph. Really appreciate your passion and your insight into how it feels from, the generation, if you like, that will take the baton from this conversation. We are nearly 10 minutes over time, but I can see from the chat that there are some questions to Anne-Marie that if Anne-Marie is willing, I'm willing to give, say, 5 minutes to, basically surface them, because there are some really important issues about supporting our land managers, such as the commoners that Lindsay Stride has put some comments in here, about how we support the very fabric and culture of our place, and the people have always sustained it to, at as much sort of more local level than some of these big ideas that we've been talking about. So I'm wondering Anne-Marie, if you would be willing to reflect on that, because it is an important element, and you're still here, and there's quite a few people still here. So I'm going to hand to you, and then I'm going to close. I hope that's okay. So could you unmute? This is going to be the vexed issue, possibly. No, we can't get you to unmute. We can't hear you. I don't really know why. I think probably in that case, unless you can unmute in the next few minutes, can I offer, and I'll see if you can nod at this, Anne-Marie, to perhaps convene a discussion between you and the Commons Defence colleagues that are on the call at a later date? Would you be willing to do that? Is that a yes? Could you put your thumb up? Yeah. So is that, I'm sorry that we can't do it right now, but I promise through, you know, witness of everyone here that we will make that happen with Anne-Marie. Okay, fantastic. So it's been a long morning, but a very inspiring morning. I hope you've enjoyed the conversation. There's a lot of thoughts for us to go away and think about, but I think, you know, very much there's ambitions that we need to kind of take forward very quickly to reflect the comments that have been made. There's a lot more discussions to happen within many of the topics that we've raised. So we only skimmed on health and well-being. There's much more detail we could talk about around the public money for public good equation within the new Agricultural Act. There's so many more conversations that we need to take forward and spend time with each other having. But this has been a great start. It's been a difficult year, but we've kept the conversation going. And I feel that there's a real energy for us to move forward together and to try and meet our vision as a Green Halo partnership for this whole area and beyond, to be a global exemplar of how our landscapes can work in harmony with a thriving economy and community. So I thank you for your time, for your insights, and in anticipation for all we're going to do together to take this forward into the next phase. Huge thanks to colleagues who have made this happen as well, Paul, Hilary, Rachel, and all the team, Sam, and anyone else I've missed. And I look forward to working with you and seeing you all hopefully in person soon. So there we are. Paul, over to you to finish the recording.
Yeah, thank you, Alison. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. We're about to close the meeting and close the recording. And thank you very much, and see you all again soon.